Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We have a wonderful panel of people here today to talk about COVID-19, detriment or boon for gender equality. So I'll start by introducing our panelists, and then each of them will take a few moments to speak, and hopefully at the conclusion we'll have a few minutes left to answer questions from the audience. Our first speaker today will be with us by Zoom, and that's Ambassador Julissa Reynoso. Ambassador Reynoso will be talking about COVID's impact on women in the United States as far as caregiving, women in the workforce, and the proposed impact of the President's Build Back Better agenda to address these issues. Ambassador Julissa Reynoso Pantalon is a Dominican-American attorney and diplomat. She is the current Chief of Staff of First Lady Jill Biden. She formerly served as a litigation and international arbitration partner with the international law firm of Winston & Strawn. Reynoso is also affiliated with the faculty at Columbia University School of Law and the School of International and Public Affairs. From March 2012 until December 2014, she served as the United States Ambassador to Uruguay. She is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the United States Department of State. And on July 27, 2021, President Biden nominated her to be the next United States Ambassador to Spain, and that nomination is pending. Also with us today is María Eugenia Gheidy. María will talk about the impact of COVID on professional women throughout Europe. Eugenia Gheidy is currently the Dean of the Barcelona Bar Association. She's also the Vice President of the Consejo General de la Abogacía Española, President of the International Relations Commission, and President of the Mediation Commission of the Federation de Barreaux de Europe. Also with us today on Zoom is Dr. Felicia Knoll. Dr. Knoll will talk about COVID's impact on inherent health inequity for women around the globe. As an international health economist and expert in Latin American health systems and social sectors, Dr. Knoll has a PhD and is the director of the Institute for the Advanced Study of the Americas and a professor at the Leonard Miller School of Medicine at the University of Miami. She currently serves as the co-chair of the Lancet Commission on Gender-Based Violence and Maltreatment of Young People, and she leads the Women, Gender, and Health Research Hub. She is also the founding president of Tomateo Apeco, a Mexican NGO dedicated to reducing the impact of cancer and improving the health of women throughout Latin America. Also with us in person today is Gheidy Santos. Gheidy would discuss the impact of COVID on women throughout Colombia. Ms. Santos is a lawyer from the University Nacional de Colombia with a specialization in economics from the University de los Andes and studies in leadership and global competitiveness from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. In addition to her work on the private sector and with the Colombian Congress, she has worked with the World Trade Organization's Trade Advisory Center in Geneva, Switzerland, and in public entities such as the National Planning Department and the Ministries of Agriculture and Commerce. Also with us today is Katharina Miller, who will be speaking to us on Zoom about the impact of COVID on women in the labor market in Europe. Katharina holds a degree in economics and law from the University of Greifswald and a master's in European Union law from the Universities of Luxembourg and Strasbourg. She is a founding partner of 3C Compliance and serves as the president of the European Women's Association, Lawyers Association. She is also a member of the Commission on European Union Law and International Law of the German Association of Women Lawyers. She was also the Spanish coordinator of the European initiative Women Shareholders Demand Gender Equality. Last but not least, in person, we have Trish Refo. Ms. Refo will discuss the impact of COVID on women lawyers in the United States and various ideas to minimize these issues. Ms. Refo is the immediate past president of the American Bar Association, the largest voluntary association of attorneys and legal professionals in the world. As a partner at Snell and Wilner in Phoenix, Arizona, Ms. Refo concentrates on complex commercial litigation and internal investigation. She also chairs the firm's professional liability group. So welcome to all of our panelists. And let me introduce myself. My name is Hilarie Bass. I'm also a former president of the American Bar Association and serve as the president of the Bass Institute on Diversity and Inclusion. So, Julissa, please join us by Zoom.
Thank you, Hilarie, and thank you for all the...
Welcome, Ambassador.
Nice to see you, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Wanted to thank the organization, the organizers, for the invitation to participate in this panel today to discuss the gendered impact of the pandemic and share with you and the rest of the participants who are watching virtually the U.S. government's approach, specifically the Biden-Harris administration's work to ensure an equitable response to recovery in the wake of the pandemic. President Biden and Vice President Harris have made very clear that advancing gender equity and equality is not only a matter of human rights, but also a strategic imperative for the United States. Even before the pandemic, gender policies were a smart investment. Advancing equality for women, girls, and the LGBTQI plus community reduces poverty, increases access to education, improves health, and fosters democracy. But in the wake of the pandemic, we in the U.S. government asked ourselves what our social and economic future could and should look like, and have recognized that pandemic recovery investments can also serve as accelerators. Now is a moment to test those values, our values, to ask what we will work toward and what we will leave behind. And so that is why the President, our administration, we've made a commitment to build back better, really taking those three words seriously and making them material to ensure an equitable recovery for all. That commitment includes marshaling a whole-of-government approach to advance gender equity and gender equality in the United States. That effort is spearheaded by my team, the White House Gender Policy Council, for which I am honored to serve as co-chair. The council was established by executive order on International Women's Day this year. The Policy Council counts amongst its members representatives from throughout the U.S. federal government, including the Departments of State, Treasury, Commerce, Housing, Health and Human Services, and the whole gamut of federal agencies. Crucially, President Biden also ensured that the council reports directly to him on our efforts to advance gender equity and equality. In November of this year, just a month ago, we affirmed our whole-of-government approach with the release of the United States' first ever national strategy on gender equity and equality. This strategy outlines how we as the government can approach this systemic problem, using 10 strategic priorities to guide the work of the council in our government-wide approach to gender equity and equality. I'm going to just quickly outline those priorities for folks to kind of understand and evaluate, we're on the right track, and also to share what we've learned are the pillars of really moving forward with a proper strategy to address these historic issues of equity and inequality. One, improving economic security, addressing gender-based violence, expanding access to health care, ensuring equal opportunity and equity in education, advancing gender equity and fairness in the justice and immigration systems, including issues involving human rights, security, and humanitarian relief, and advancing full participation of women and girls in democracy, representation, including roles in leadership. The strategy recognizes that these priorities are all interconnected. Education of girls affects their future economic security. Gender-based violence includes sexual harassment and abuse, hampers economic and political participation, and influences the health and well-being of survivors. Restrictions on access to health care, including sexual and reproductive health services, undermine women's ability to take care of their families, advance in the workplace, and lead in all sectors. The pandemic, we know, has made clear, and this is not just a U.S.-based problem, it has made it clear throughout the world, that a government-wide strategy centered on gender equity with a particular focus on its intersections, the intersections of gender with racial equity, is urgently needed. The data has shown us that the COVID-19 pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on women and girls all around the world, whether they're frontline workers or mothers juggling demands, including caregiving of their children or their elderly parents. The pandemic also upended the lives of too many girls around the globe, exacerbating disparities and underscoring what we have long known, that during the times of crisis, girls, especially girls of color and those from underserved and low-income communities and ethnic minorities, face disproportionate challenges. As schools closed, caregiving burdens fell on girls across the globe, and girls were often significantly less likely to have access to devices required for virtual schooling due to a global digital gender divide. Ensuring an equitable recovery, what we deem building back better, is a top priority for the Council and the White House in our efforts at both home and abroad. Throughout the world, economic insecurity combined with lockdowns, mobility restriction, and other public health measures during the pandemic have also led to increased rates of gender-based violence. Women and girls have faced increased rates of domestic violence, disrupted access to sexual and reproductive health service, and loss of access to education. And of course, access to education itself is a critical strategy for preventing and combating gender-based violence. Survivors of gender-based violence have faced challenges in accessing a gamut of services, from basic health to psychosocial support and other services during this pandemic. We will address these challenges as we develop our first ever national action plan on gender-based violence, which we are developing here in the White House, the whole of government approach to gender-based violence, which will include an update to our global strategy on this issue. In previous public health emergencies, we saw the serious impacts that overburdened healthcare systems and disruptions in care had on women's and girls' access to sexual and reproductive health services. And it's been no different this time. To be clear, increasing access to comprehensive health care, addressing health disparities, and promoting sexual and reproductive health and rights are all central to advancing gender equity and equality. So, building back better means increasing economic security and opportunity for women and girls, and addressing structural barriers to labor force participation, and taking steps to close wage and wealth gaps at home and abroad. And here in the United States, women, especially women of color, not surprisingly, make up the majority of essential workers, services in frontline jobs, and taking on greater health risks to keep our society, our basic programs and our basic services running. Women's labor in places like stores, hospitals, homes, and beyond has long been critical to keeping this country running and really the whole world. And the past year has made these contributions even more visible. In fact, during the height of the pandemic, American women's labor force participation, the formal labor force participation, plunged to its lowest point in over 30 years. More than 2 million American women exited the formal workforce. They had to choose between their jobs or businesses and taking care of their loved ones at home. Work to advance women's economic security must include addressing caregiving needs, which have grown substantially during the pandemic. Women provide the majority of care work to their families, and this is a phenomenon that is really global, and it's been this way as far back as we can conceive of humanity. The caregiving crisis laid bare by the pandemic demonstrates plainly just how vital care work is. The often unpaid, sometimes informal, and many times unseen care work, chiefly performed by women, sustains the paid formal economy. And it's integral to our government, to my administration's, the President Biden's administration's commitment to building back better. Really, since President Biden took office, he has taken big and bold steps to set up on this path. Earlier this year, United States Congress passed the President's first major initiative as a president, first legislative initiative, the American Rescue Plan, what we call the ARP. The ARP met the moment by providing immediate relief for millions of Americans with direct payments into the hands of hard-working families. It also extended unemployment insurance benefits and increased tax credits, child tax credit and earned income tax credits to parents, expanding childcare assistance, and provided essential support to survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. We were very focused in ensuring that the issue of gender-based violence was integral to that legislative package. And through our latest initiative, the initiative really engaged on this issue at the global level, initiative we're calling Building Back Better World. We are ensuring a focus on gender equality in our efforts to support infrastructure development throughout our global efforts. Globally, the administration, this is under, again, President Biden, launched the Gender Equity and Equality Action Fund to advance women's economic security around the world, particularly in the wake of this devastating pandemic. There is still work to be done to advance gender equity and equality. Through the implementation of the National Strategy on Gender Equity and Equality, we in the White House and the Gender Policy Council in particular will continue striving for a recovery that lifts up everyone, especially those who historically have been left behind and now have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. I want to thank you for allowing me this opportunity to share these thoughts on what we're doing here in the United States to address the challenges faced by women and girls and the devastating impact that the pandemic has had on our community here in the United States. These issues are not unique to the United States. We think we've made tremendous progress. We have more to do, and I look forward to ensuring that these lessons learned are shared with others on this panel and throughout this conference today. And obviously, we also look forward to learning from what other countries and other communities are doing to make sure that we, as a global community, are building back better. So thanks again for inviting me, Hilarie, and it's great to see everyone, and thanks again, and I look forward to hearing from others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us today. Next, we have Eugenia Gheidy from Barcelona. Eugenia.
Thank you, Hilarie. Okay. Yes, thank you, Hilarie. Muchísimas gracias, Hilarie, por tu presentación y por tu compromiso, sin duda, con la igualdad, que sé que hace años que luchas y que batallas por ella, en un país en el que también poco a poco las mujeres se van abriendo camino. Y creo hoy que hablar de igualdad y de los efectos de la COVID en las mujeres resulta de especial importancia, y más con el título, ¿no?, de oportunidades y perjuicios, en el que, bueno, de una manera muy clara, con esta dualidad que nos presenta esta terrible pandemia que hemos tenido que afrontar en todas las esferas de nuestra vida, que ha afectado a todos nuestros sectores a los que nos dedicamos profesionalmente, pues sin duda invita a hacer una reflexión profunda y serena sobre en qué situación nos quedamos las mujeres después de estos efectos devastadores en el ámbito económico, social, político que hemos podido vivir. Las mujeres, sin duda, y sobre todo pues en el momento de las crisis sanitarias y humanitarias, son las que mayor incidencia tienen en cuanto a los perjuicios que van a sufrir. No solo ellas, sino también los colectivos vulnerables, aquellos que menos tienen son los que suelen además perder más en estas situaciones. Y las mujeres, yo creo que además, por este problema de desigualdades que ya de manera estructural venimos arrastrando desde hace tantos años, estos sesgos, estos estereotipos que hemos ido saltando poco a poco, pues sin duda que aun a pesar de los 25 años que hace ya de la Declaración de Beijing, todavía persisten. Y sobre todo en las diferentes esferas de la vida en la que nos movemos en el ámbito laboral, que se manifiesta de una manera intolerable en muchísimas formas. En primer lugar, una incomprensible brecha salarial. Esta situación es unánime en todos los países. Yo creo que la ratio aproximada debe oscilar en un 20% aproximadamente, sea cual sea la profesión, sea cual sea el país. Yo creo que hay una situación real que tenemos que afrontar y que todavía se está agudizando más con la crisis que estamos viviendo. Y es esta denominada brecha salarial que nos sigue azotando y que debemos trabajar, y veremos un poco cómo, porque esferas como esta y escenarios como este nos van a permitir pues sacar unas conclusiones y ver qué es lo que podemos hacer para mejorar esta situación. Luego, el denominado techo de cristal. Esta dificultad de las mujeres para acceder a los cargos de mayor representatividad. En concreto, en la abogacía, y ayer también lo hablábamos con la primera dama, nos encontramos con una estructura piramidal en los puestos de responsabilidad importantísima. Las bases están compuestas mayoritariamente por mujeres en el ámbito de la abogacía y en el ámbito de la judicatura en España, pero conforme vas avanzando la responsabilidad, conforme vamos aumentando el nivel profesional y de cargo, la presencia de las mujeres resulta cada vez inferior. Por lo tanto, nuevamente, esta situación se verá afectada y aumentada por causa de esta crisis sanitaria que nos ha azotado. Luego, esta también infrarrepresentación femenina que se traduce también en las empresas, tanto privadas como entidades públicas. Luego, todavía unas políticas de conciliación muy alejadas de la corresponsabilidad, muy alejadas de lo que sería deseable en un estado del bienestar que apuesta por la democracia y que apuesta por el Estado de Derecho. Por lo tanto, nuevamente un escenario que nos ha de hacer reflexionar. Luego también seguimos en el ámbito de las relaciones familiares, siendo las que asumimos la crianza de los hijos y de las hijas, del cuidado de los familiares, ya sean también en momentos de dificultad o no, y también de la gestión tanto de las labores como de la economía del hogar. Esta falta de corresponsabilidad, sin duda que lo que dificulta es la conciliación laboral y familiar y, por tanto, frena el desarrollo profesional de las mujeres, aparcándolas en muchos casos y, por lo tanto, con mayores posibilidades de sufrir esta vulnerabilidad y este escenario de pobreza que luego la va a rodear. Yo creo que es muy importante tener en cuenta, por ejemplo, que en España, y estoy absolutamente convencida que se reproduce también en todos los países, que según los datos del Instituto Nacional de Estadística, las mujeres buscan ofertas de empleo con reducciones de jornada precisamente por estas necesidades de tener que atender las responsabilidades familiares. Y esto es así en un 66% más que los hombres. Luego también es importante ver un dato muy relevante, y es que el 73% de las mujeres han pedido una excedencia por cuidado de los hijos e hijas y en 1 a 6 años aproximadamente. Y solo el 1% de los hombres, imaginaros la diferencia del 73 al 1%, han pedido una excedencia. Estos datos se han de poder también poner en relación, aunque los hombres revelan una vida laboral de 35 años aproximadamente en el 48% de ellos. Es decir, que aproximadamente este 48% de hombres han trabajado, han cotizado y han estado pues aportando trabajo en una media de 35 años, cuando solo el 20% de las mujeres en España ha acreditado trabajar más de 35 años. Por lo tanto, esta situación, que yo creo que se ha de poner en correlación, afecta no solo a las circunstancias de temporalidad y discriminación en el momento actual que están viviendo las mujeres con unos salarios muchísimo más bajos y en unas condiciones laborales de infrarrepresentación, sino que además supone que las remuneraciones futuras también van a ser mucho menores. Por lo tanto, nuevamente, las mujeres mayores vuelven a ser vulnerables en el futuro a la hora de percibir sus pensiones por jubilación. Y, sin duda, que el entorno y la crisis de la COVID va a acentuar nuevamente esta situación. La resolución de dicho desequilibrio yo creo que sin duda pasa por la adopción de medidas en materia de conciliación que resulten efectivas y que aprovechen el potencial de las nuevas tecnologías que nos van a ofrecer en estos entornos laborales. Y también de ser capaces de trasladar a las empresas que la pérdida del talento femenino les va a salir muy caro, porque cuando una mujer ha proyectado toda su carrera profesional y ha dedicado todo su talento a una empresa, en el momento en el que no va a encontrar políticas de conciliación adecuadas y que, por lo tanto, se va a ver obligada a renunciar a esa responsabilidad o a este puesto profesional, la empresa va a perder un capital humano que se ha dedicado a la empresa durante muchísimos años y que, por lo tanto, va a implicar la pérdida de un talento que económicamente le va a salir muy caro. En España ha habido ya una empresa que se ha dedicado al estudio de esta pérdida del talento femenino y realmente los números son esperanzadores para que las empresas reaccionen, no para la mujer, porque realmente la situación en la que se ha visto pues, atrapada resulta complicada, pero está siendo, yo creo, esperanzador el dato que ha revelado toda vez que las empresas van a ser conscientes de la necesidad de preservar este talento. Creo también que esta situación, estas dificultades que hemos ido teniendo las mujeres, se han visto un poco aceleradas por el tema de lo que ha supuesto el afrontar el teletrabajo. Si bien es cierto que ha aportado una serie de beneficios, ¿no? Porque sin duda pues va a suponer que la mujer pueda conciliar en cierto modo los espacios profesionales con los familiares, no hemos de verlo como una trampa que nos obligue a ser también nuevamente nosotras las que realicemos este teletrabajo desde casa y que, por lo tanto, seamos nuevamente las mujeres las que tengamos que cargar con estas obligaciones familiares. Por lo tanto, yo creo que, sin duda, que el empoderamiento de la mujer y la promoción del talento femenino son hoy más necesarios que nunca. La igualdad de género yo creo que va mucho más allá que una cuestión de ética o de justicia. Y también es una oportunidad de crecimiento para la cohesión de las empresas y de la sociedad, sin duda. Esta corresponsabilidad va a ser más necesaria que nunca, sobre todo porque nos estamos encontrando en un momento en que se hace muy necesario procurar el fortalecimiento de las estructuras sociales y asistenciales más básicas del Estado, a la vez que modernizar estas mismas de acuerdo con los criterios de sostenibilidad y de igualdad de oportunidades. No quiero alargar más, que creo que me están llamando ya la atención, así que muchísimas gracias, Hilarie.
Thank you, Eugenia. Next, we will be hearing from Dr. Felicia Knoll on Zoom from Miami.
Que tanto quiero, que es Colombia. Thank you again to Hilarie Bass for organizing yet again an incredibly important panel and for inviting us and making this possible and making it possible for us to attend from different parts of the world. There is no doubt that COVID-19 has erased possibly decades of progress in advancing gender equality and empowerment. And a lot of that relates to the health of women and to the healthcare sector. What I'm going to share when we talk about, though, the detriment or the boon is how we can modify that risk. The huge risks of gender-concentrated excess mortality, the huge risks of weakened health systems, and how that will feed back into a vicious cycle of less health, less empowerment, more gender inequality, and less economic growth. As I said about a year ago when we were together, we need to think about this not as a pandemic, but as a syndemic, which is what The Lancet has put forward, and particularly their editor-in-chief, Richard Horton. This is a synergistic set of pandemics, a confluence of non-communicable diseases, poverty, and discrimination based on race, based on ethnicity, based on gender. And that means it is an intersectional disaster where race, gender, and poverty interact. And sadly, the tools that we have had at our disposal, before the vaccine at least, were not that dissimilar to the Black Plague, and they reinforced the risks of gender-based violence, violence against women, violence against children, and of much of the suffering that we saw in our world. Since I'm trying to represent a little bit of the health sector in this panel, I wanted to share the relatively updated data from Johns Hopkins of 5.2 million deaths and 262 million cases around our world. But particularly relevant for this event taking place in beloved Colombia is what has happened in our region, one of the worst hit in the world. As of the 25th of November, those data from Johns Hopkins are showing that 5 countries of the Latin American region are among the 20 with the highest levels of deaths from COVID-19. That's Brazil, Mexico, Peru, unfortunately Colombia as well, and Argentina. Yet they are not the most populated of our world. So for example, Brazil is number 6 in population, but number 2 in deaths. Colombia is number 29 in population, but number 11 in deaths. This means that we are seeing and will continue to see huge suffering. So what is the detriment? First, the health of women. We have seen, and now the data are very clear, something that's tremendously worrying in terms of non-communicable diseases like cancer. We already knew that we were facing late detection, that we had a tsunami of chronic and non-communicable diseases around the world, in lower income countries and in higher income countries, and definitely within the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. But we were seeing all of this late detection before the pandemic. The pandemic hits, and suddenly we see an absence of many of the cases that we should have been detecting. So it looked almost as though there was less cancer, for example, in our region. If we look at Mexico, we saw a 20% decline in the number of cases of breast cancer and more than 40% in the number of cervical cancers. That is not a true number. Those cases were there. It just means that they were not found, even given the late detection, which means that our region is facing now, beginning to come out of the pandemic, we hope, this backlog, this tsunami that's gotten worse of non-communicable diseases with a strong gender focus. Violence against women, violence against children, already highlighted by the ambassador. And so as we've written, my colleague Flavia Bustreo and I in The Lancet, gender-based violence was a pandemic before this pandemic. It will continue to be a pandemic after this pandemic, and it's only gotten worse. But I wanted to add one piece to what the ambassador so cogently said, which is the risk of cyber violence. This was a risk before, but it grew tremendously, particularly with all of our online presence. And this is a message particularly to our legal community, which is that we do not have nationally or globally the legislation that we require to begin to even think of controlling this other huge wave of violence. And if we think about boon or detriment, it could risk turning what could be a boon, which is access, communication, into a huge detriment. Now, thinking about women in the health sector, women are, yes, consumers of health, but we are also the majority providers and producers of paid and unpaid healthcare around our world. In 2015, we published data in The Lancet showing that the value of women's contributions to health was 5% of GDP, half paid and half unrecognized and unpaid. But those numbers did not include discrimination. In more recent work, which we'll hope to be soon publishing, we're looking at more like 7 to 8% of global GDP. Only 2 to 3% for men, but overall we are talking about 10% of global GDP, and this is a hugely gendered number. And another percent that keeps coming up is 70. Women account for about 70% of the paid hours of work, and they also account for about 70% of the unpaid hours of work. If I translate those unpaid hours into people, it's about 200 million full-time equivalent professionals in our world. That's the unpaid care. If we think about just the discrimination factor in health, it's about 10 to 15% of the total, which should not seem small because that's 1.25% of global GDP. But I wanted to look at medicine for a minute because we have seen the feminization of medicine over the last decades, and that is a wonderful thing. It used to be the bastion occupation for men. It is no longer the case. The majority of those studying health in Latin America are women today. Yet while they're the majority of medical students, they face tremendous barriers in entering the market and in participating. And again, these are only going to get worse because of the pandemic. So the majority of under and unemployment of physicians is among women. That means we see people without doctors and doctors without employment, but the majority of those doctors are women, women who are fully trained to provide medical care, yet are outside of the market because of a series of barriers to entry. We also have a huge problem with women in leadership in this sector. I've been going back to the data on our National Academies of Medicine because that's still an area that's of status, again, particularly in our region. And not to pick on one, I could have said about almost any of them, but the Brazilian National Academy of Medicine, established in 1829, has never had a female president, and to date, only 5% of the members are women. When we look at deans around the region, only 1 in 3. This issue in leadership translates into a problem in doing what we need to do, which is to talk about pandemic preparedness with a gender transformative lens. That is true pandemic preparedness, or better said, true syndemic preparedness. So where is the boon? First, finally, and we've been saying this, economists have been saying this for decades, but finally I think the world knows that investing in health is investing in economic development as well. And that means we have an incredible space for being able to do stronger work on health reform, guaranteeing social and financial protection to all of those who do not have access today, at least half in our region, the majority women, to prepaid, pooled kinds of health insurance and to protection in the labor market. It's an opportunity to link labor market reform to health reform and to guarantee, for example, leave, not only for maternity and paternity leave, but also for the care of those who are unwell, equally distributed by gender. Second, I don't think we can forget this idea that women are both producers of health as well as consumers of health. And breaking down those barriers to entry will mean that we have a much stronger labor force of physicians. But breaking down those barriers also means breaking down the discrimination we see across the board in the health sector in every occupation for women versus men, meaning that they pull out, they're less incentivized, and they are not going to be able to live up to their full potential. Telemedicine. I see a huge opportunity for telemedicine and telehealth in the sector, but also for the health of women and for the healthy participation of women in the economy and particularly in the health sector. So we can see, and I think we could even use this in the future, medicine is almost a tracer for where we can go in looking at gender equality in our world and certainly in our region, and thinking of a gender transformative, gender equal approach to pandemic preparedness going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Knoll. Very interesting concepts for us to think about. Next up, Ms. Santos.
Hello. Thank you, Hilarie. Muy buenas tardes. Muy complacida de estar en este Congreso Internacional de Derecho. Y antes de iniciar, yo quisiera agradecer muy especialmente a Hilarie, porque tenemos el honor de estar acá en este panel con mujeres líderes internacionales que han asumido como propia la causa de la equidad de género, no meramente de discurso, de acción. Hilarie, en su liderazgo desde ABA Rolling, ha venido apoyando de manera muy decidida la política implementada por nuestro presidente Iván Duque en el tema de apoyo a las mujeres migrantes venezolanas. Así que, Hilarie, quería iniciar este panel agradeciendo muy especialmente porque esto es una acción concreta. Quiero saludar también a todas las colegas de paneles, líderes destacadas del continente americano, del continente europeo, contando una cosa que nos apasiona y que nos inspira en este país, y es el avance de los derechos de las mujeres. Y yo quiero compartir hoy en este panel, en mi rol hoy de consejera presidencial de Equidad de la Mujer, una historia de esperanza, de transformación que ha venido liderando el gobierno del presidente Iván Duque y de la vicepresidenta Marta Lucía Ramírez a favor de las mujeres. Quiero iniciar diciendo que es la primera vez que un gobierno asume una política pública en favor de más de la mitad de la población de las mujeres. Una política pública que pasa de ser una política de gobierno para consolidarse en una política de Estado. Y nos enorgullece mucho decir que dejamos la hoja de ruta trazada para que los próximos 2 gobiernos sigan construyendo sobre el legado transformacional que deja este gobierno con un sueño, y es que en el 2030 Colombia sea el líder indiscutible a nivel internacional en el objetivo de desarrollo número 5, que es el tema que nos convoca hoy, la equidad de género. Y para responder a la pregunta de este panel, si el COVID ha sido una amenaza o una oportunidad, por supuesto que ha sido una amenaza para la población entera, pero este gobierno ha sabido transformarlo en una extraordinaria oportunidad. Y voy a contar por qué. Desde el día 1, el eje central de nuestra política de equidad de las mujeres ha sido generar empoderamiento económico a favor de las mujeres, autonomía económica, porque entendemos que este es el tema central para el efectivo goce y ejercicio de todos los derechos que tienen las mujeres. ¿Y qué hicimos en COVID? Acelerar y profundizar esa política. Primero quiero ilustrar a todas las personas que nos están siguiendo en este importante Congreso Internacional cómo estaba Colombia en un tema que ha sido especialmente crítico para las mujeres de Colombia y de todo el mundo, porque es un reto de humanidad, y es la generación de ingresos económicos, empleo. El tema se llama empleo. En los últimos 20 años, Colombia había tenido una brecha de desempleo de más o menos 5.4 puntos porcentuales, eso es antes de COVID. Durante COVID, en el punto más alto, llegamos a una brecha de 8.5 porcentuales. Y ahora estamos en una brecha de 7.2 puntos porcentuales. ¿Por qué? Porque este gobierno ha implementado una política económica con sello de mujer precisamente porque entiende y atiende las necesidades que hemos tenido las mujeres en este país. ¿Y qué hicimos? En primer lugar, una política para generar más empleo a favor de las mujeres. A mí, Hilarie, me honra mucho decir que es la primera vez que Colombia tiene una reforma tributaria, una reforma fiscal con enfoque de género, que está dando subsidios específicos para mantener el empleo, 40% de subsidio a favor de los hombres, 50% a favor de las mujeres. Eso como resultado que generó en la pandemia, poder mantener cerca de la tercera parte del empleo formal femenino, empleo de calidad en este país. Pero no se trata solamente de mantener empleo, tenemos que crear nuevo empleo a favor de las mujeres. Pues la reforma tributaria también tiene un paquete de incentivos tributarios de 25% para la contratación de mujeres jóvenes, porque entendemos también que ha sido el segmento de población más afectado en Colombia y en el mundo, y de 15% para mujeres mayores de 28 años. ¿Qué esperamos? Que en los próximos 2 años se creen cerca de 350.000 nuevos empleos a favor de las mujeres en Colombia. Y quiero contarles que esto ya tiene resultados en el día a día, en la vida de las mujeres. Precisamente ayer salieron las últimas cifras de empleo y esto también nos emociona mucho contarlo, porque así es que llega la política a todas las mujeres de Colombia. En octubre se recuperaron más de 850.000 empleos en el país, gracias a nuestra estrategia de vacunación masiva y de reactivación económica. Y de esos 850.000 empleos, más del 67% corresponden a mujeres. Ya llevamos 4 meses donde somos las mujeres colombianas quienes estamos liderando la reactivación económica con más empleo y con más empleo formal. Y este es un tema muy importante. Y el segundo camino que también hemos adoptado es el emprendimiento como el camino más expedito para crear empleo. Y el gran legado que le vamos a dejar a este país es consolidar a Colombia como una nación de mujeres emprendedoras. Ya hemos apoyado a más de 840.000 mujeres emprendedoras, sobre todo rurales y emprendedoras urbanas. Y para consolidar esos negocios con una visión de mercado, de rentabilidad, escalabilidad, quiero contarles rápidamente que creamos 3 instrumentos de ley. Un fondo Mujer Emprende, para cofinanciar esos emprendimientos, que ya cuenta con un capital semilla de 15 millones de dólares, compras públicas con sello de mujer y las regalías. Las regalías son los recursos que tiene Colombia por su actividad mineroenergética, que también deben incorporar ese sello de género. El resultado de toda esta historia es que hoy Colombia ya es reconocida a nivel internacional por esta política económica. La OCDE nos ha establecido como el país líder en América Latina en equidad de género. Se hablaba previamente en el panel de la brecha salarial, somos el país en la OCDE con la menor brecha salarial. Y este último punto que quisiera compartir con toda la audiencia, Naciones Unidas, por esta política económica que hemos implementado a favor de las mujeres, nos seleccionó a nivel internacional para ser el país pionero en estructurar y en colocar un bono soberano de equidad de género. Colombia a nivel internacional siendo disruptivo, innovando las políticas públicas para financiar a favor de las mujeres en región, a favor de las mujeres rurales. Y quiero cerrar con esto, porque el otro gran drama que hemos vivido todas las mujeres ha sido la exacerbación de la violencia, un flagelo que entre todos tenemos que derrotar. Pues bien, Colombia también ha entendido que el principal antídoto para derrotar ese flagelo es precisamente el empoderamiento económico. Más autonomía económica para una mujer en Colombia y en el mundo es menos violencia en su contra. Termino diciendo que, siguiendo los lineamientos del Fondo Monetario Internacional, consideramos que las mujeres deben ser las protagonistas del desarrollo económico. Somos la columna vertebral del restablecimiento de ese tejido social que se ha visto afectado por el COVID, pero sobre todo, en este momento en Colombia y en el mundo, debemos ser el motor de la reactivación económica. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much. Next we have Katharina Miller on Zoom.
From Europe, it's freezing cold here. I can see it's hotter with you. So, yeah. And thank you very much also to the World Law Association and especially to María, Eugenia, Gheidy for inviting me also to be on this panel. It's an honor for me. I would love to speak, as Hilarie already mentioned, about domestic workers. Yeah, all the fantastic previous speakers have mentioned that migrant women is an issue within our world. And my speech is also like a wake-up call to all of us that also we work with migrant workers, maybe in our households or in our homes, or that we know that our families work with them, to maybe change something. Why? Well, I'm going to tell you now. I just give you a short overview of important data on domestic workers and which organization is better than the International Labour Organization to give us such data. So the ILO estimates that there are 67.1 million domestic workers around the world, with 11.5 million of these workers to be migrants. Domestic workers perform work in or for a household with roles to perform household tasks and provide personal assistance to the person who pays for this work. And the tasks that such domestic workers normally have to do include cooking, cleaning, garden maintenance, and taking care of children. The nature and the type of work done by domestic work is undertaken within the private sphere, and that's the reason why all of our governments all over the world are quite resistant in regulating the issues surrounding domestic workers. That's why I will tell you now seven challenging issues. That's why more than half of all domestic workers have no statutory limitations of their working hours. And this means that the working hours domestic workers take can be long and unregulated. Second, 2 out of 5 are not entitled to be paid a minimum wage, and many of these workers are paid below the minimum wage, which affect their ability to save during COVID-19. Next, 29% of domestic workers are excluded from labor legislation with the consequences of not being considered regular workers. That means that these workers are vulnerable to unfair dismissals that cannot be challenged. Next. 83% of domestic workers are women. Women are vulnerable to consequences of not having social and economic rights such as human trafficking, sexual slavery, and fears of deportation. And last, more than a third of these women have no right to maternity leave. So, this has already been an issue, and I think, Felicita, you have said this before when you talked about the health issue. Also, the domestic workers issue is not new, but the problem is it became a burning issue during COVID-19. Why? Well, we have identified some key problems. So, for example, domestic workers' eligibility for social security with the decrease in employment available. Then the effects of lockdown laws and social distancing affecting the movement of the domestic worker within the European Union, if we focus on the European Union. So, for example, just to give you an example, I know, it's just one of so many, a lady from Moldova. Moldova is not part of the European Union. She worked in a household in Madrid. And so this lady can only live in Madrid for 3 months. And after 3 months, she would have to go back to Moldova. And then she can come back to Spain. And the problem is, during the pandemic, she just got stuck in Spain, and she was not able to go back to Moldova. The Moldavians didn't want to have her back. She was not able, she was not legal then at a certain stage in Spain, so she was not able to get any support, any help. She didn't have any income. She didn't have even a flat. So it was really a terrible situation, and this is only one of many more examples that I could give you, only speaking and thinking of Madrid. And the effects of the domestic worker status, immigration status, when there are travel restrictions, as I've just mentioned right now. So this is really devastating, and it really shows, I think, that there's an issue and that we should do something about this. I don't have a number on how much we are really profiting, everybody of us, or on how much our governments are profiting on the fact that we have domestic workers, but I can only imagine that each household and each government is really profiting enormously of these domestic workers, and that we depend on them. So what can be done? Well, I think, and being a lawyer, I really would like to invite all the countries worldwide that have not done so far to ratify the ILO 189 Convention on Domestic Workers. Because this convention wants to protect domestic workers from abuse, harassment, and violence. It allows fair terms of employment, decent working conditions, and living conditions protect domestic worker privacy. And the workers are informed of terms and conditions of employment. So, for example, unfortunately, my beloved Spain has not ratified yet this ILO Convention 189, neither France, neither the United States, and especially Spain and France in the European Union are the countries that employ the highest number of domestic workers within the European Union. So I really want to urge Spain to think of this, starting to ratify this very important convention. Because in Spain, more than 600,000 persons work as domestic workers, and 88% of domestic workers are women. And with this, I would like to finish. I want to thank you very much for your attention. And I'm very much looking forward to the last speaker right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katharina. Much appreciated. And last but not least, we have Trish Refo from the United States. Trish.
All right. I steal the microphone from the moderator. First, let me say what a privilege it is to be with you all here in this beautiful town, in this wonderful country. I got almost no travel as president of the American Bar Association last year because of COVID, but One of the two international trips that I was able to do was to Colombia, and here I am back again, and I am delighted to be back again and to be on a panel with such extraordinary women. You know, my goodness, if you put this group of women and those who joined us on Zoom in charge of all the problems in the world, I think they'd make some pretty serious progress. So it is a privilege to be with all of you. You know, as I talk briefly about what happened to women lawyers in America as a consequence of COVID, it is also a moment to remind ourselves why gatherings like this are so important and why organizations like the World Jurist Association and the American Bar Association are so important. Because they gather together lawyers and people who care about the rule of law to talk about these important issues collectively together, because it is together that we can achieve action. It is together that our voices can be heard and be loud. So I am grateful to have this opportunity to talk about all of this. All people are worse for what we have experienced during COVID. There is nothing special about lawyers that makes lawyers, you know, suffer more or differently, I think, than all other people. This has been an impossibly difficult to get through period for all of us, everywhere in the world. All people have been affected by what we have been through. But there are some things we have learned about women lawyers in particular in the United States that we thought would be of interest to you. The American Bar Association decided to do an empirical survey early on in the pandemic to talk with lawyers, men and women, about their experiences in COVID. And we did not go in expecting to see some of the gender differences that we did, but we certainly found them. And the results of that work are available to you on the American Bar Association website. It is a study called Practice Forward, and it is free, and as I said, available on americanbar.org. The first and one of the most important, I think, findings is that while all people, and certainly all lawyers, suffered increased stress as a consequence of COVID, women suffered disproportionately more stress. I think we can, women lawyers, I should say, I think we can all imagine, without looking at the data, what some of those stressors are. They are around caregiving for children. They are around caregiving for elders and others who need assistance, and those issues in the United States as much as elsewhere disproportionately fall on women. Interestingly, the level of stress for women with children increased as the age of the children decreased. That too is intuitive, right? That a 3-year-old requires more care perhaps than a 16-year-old. Boundaries were difficult for women as well as for men. Boundaries between work and home when all of us were trying to work from home. This was not in the study, but we all know that domestic violence increased as a consequence of COVID. And unless you assume that no women lawyers are victims of domestic violence, which I am unwilling to assume, I think we must also assume that women lawyers also suffered a disproportionate increase in domestic violence as a consequence of COVID. Broadband access, by the way, becomes extremely important as we think about the consequences of COVID. In my country, particularly in the West, we have large spaces of land that are largely unpopulated. And the persons who occupy those lands frequently have no access to the internet. And that impacted those children and those women and those men disproportionately in terms of their access to legal help, education, and any number of other things during the pandemic. We have not yet seen specific study about what happened to our law students, but I worry about our law students. I worry about the men and the women who had to experience their law school years, in some cases a year and a half, remotely instead of in person. Our tradition in the United States has long been that to learn to be a lawyer requires you to be in a brick and mortar building with other people who are schooled in our craft and in our profession. And we are about to graduate cohorts of people who did not have that experience. So I worry about that. However, as with all things, there are negatives and there are positives as well. One of the positives, I think, is how many of us watched a man interact on a Zoom meeting with a kid or a pet or a dog, jumping into the experience. That used to be something in a way that was limited to women. And I actually think the fact that most of us have now watched our male colleagues deal with that is a small positive as we move forward. I think COVID has created more flexibility in the legal profession for women, and you can see that in what large law firms and corporate America are giving in terms of flex hours and the like, and work from home options to women lawyers in our country. Many young women lawyers are simply saying, I'm not gonna come back to the office 5 days a week. It's not gonna happen. And if you want me to stay here, you're gonna have to come up with something else. That is particularly acute right now because in the United States, there is a big talent fight going on for good lawyers, good men lawyers and good women lawyers. And so the lawyers are a bit in the driver's seat right now, and law firms are having to make all kinds of changes to accommodate the requirements and the requests of both young men lawyers and young women lawyers. I want to close with this thought, the one sort of not hopeful thought that I will offer. And I will tell you that what worries me right now is that we don't know what we don't know. There is so much about this experience that we are living through together that we don't know what it's going to turn out to look like. We don't fully understand even the impact of the disease itself on those who have had it. I dare say we don't yet fully understand the social impact, the economic impact, and the political impact that this will have going forward. So I say we need to be vigilant and we need to watch and learn as much as we can about what we don't yet know. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Trish. So you can see from health inequity to labor laws for domestic workers to American lawyers to what European lawyers are facing. We had an incredibly in-depth discussion today from a great number of panelists, so please join me in thanking all of them for their participation today. We do have a few moments to open it up for questions from the audience, if there are any out there. In the meantime, let me ask the members of the panel your thoughts about what we as employers can do to ease women coming back into the workforce post-pandemic.
Yo creo, Hilarie, que lo más importante es luchar para que las empresas apliquen planes de igualdad, ¿no? Es decir, un plan de igualdad que contemple medidas de conciliación, que contemple medidas que permitan que la mujer no abandone su carrera profesional y que, por lo tanto, pues pueda seguir luchando, trabajando, proyectando, ambicionando y bueno, soñando en un futuro mejor y también prometedor. Por lo tanto, primero que los empresarios y las empresarias tengan presente que han de cumplir con planes de igualdad. Nuestra compañera de Colombia hacía referencia a las medidas del gobierno colombiano que me han parecido muy acertadas, realmente. España ha adoptado recientemente también la necesaria obligación de que las empresas con más de 50 trabajadores deberán tener planes de igualdad obligatorios que contemplen esta carrera profesional de la mujer y que también reflejen la transparencia salarial y una retribución que sea también igualitaria entre hombres y mujeres. Y luego también yo creo que es muy importante el hecho de que seamos capaces de crear entornos de formación en corresponsabilidad en nuestras universidades, en nuestros colegios, que realmente seamos capaces de educar a los niños y a las niñas en corresponsabilidad, que resulta fundamental hoy en día, ¿no? El que no tengamos que renunciar a nuestra ambición familiar, ¿no?, de tener hijos para ambicionar profesionalmente, que esto es lo que ha sucedido en los últimos años, ¿no? Aspecto que ha retrasado la maternidad, aspecto que ha provocado que las mujeres en una edad determinada, al menos en Europa y sobre todo en España, pues retrasaran tanto la maternidad que tuvieran problemas de fertilidad para tener hijos, lo que luego también acrecentaba las dificultades en los embarazos, lo que aumentaba las bajas, lo que aumentaba los problemas en el trabajo, en el puesto de trabajo, el entorno laboral. Y por lo tanto se ha generado una cadena en torno a la falsa incorporación de la mujer en el trabajo, ¿no?, en el que sin duda ha habido una serie de circunstancias que le han acabado perjudicando. Es muy importante que se dicten las leyes con perspectiva de género. La última ley también que se ha aprobado, que se ha tenido que reformar la reciente ley que había de igualdad también en España, porque en el momento en que se daban los permisos de paternidad o maternidad, se hacía que tenía que ser a elección del padre o la madre. Obviamente la elección siempre era para la madre y ahora va a ser obligatorio que el padre y la madre vayan a abandonar su puesto de trabajo, porque no es un tema de mujer a marido, era un tema de socio a socia, de compañero de trabajo a compañera de trabajo, porque tú, mujer embarazada, tenías que abandonar tu puesto de trabajo, en tanto el padre, que quizás había tenido también un hijo en el mismo tiempo, continuaba trabajando, continuaba, ¿no?, en los despachos de abogados, pues continuaba facturando, continuaba al lado del cliente, continuaba saliendo a hacer networking con el cliente, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, esto es lo que a nosotras nos colocaba en situación de desigualdad. Ahora la ley en España obliga al padre y a la madre el mismo tiempo a permanecer en casa y esto va a suponer una igualdad en los puestos de trabajo, ya no solo en el hogar, que esto ya es algo que tampoco nos vamos a meter en la libertad de las familias, pero es una igualdad real en el trabajo, ¿no?
Okay, Hilarie, thank you so much for that question. Lo que yo diría es que este tema de equidad de género hay que tomarlo con toda la rigurosidad. Y solo se puede tomar con rigurosidad lo que se mide y lo que es susceptible de evaluar. Por eso a la pregunta de qué deberían hacer los empleadores, la sugerencia que nosotros tendríamos es hacer certificaciones en equidad de género. ¿Por qué? Porque eso primero permite establecer una línea base de cómo está una empresa en equidad de género. Segundo, de implementar planes de acción para mejorar esa equidad de género, claro, y las conversaciones que nosotros tenemos de manera permanente con el sector empresarial, porque además debo decir, somos unos firmes creyentes que es el sector privado el principal aliado para el avance de los derechos de las mujeres. Ellos dicen, bueno, ¿y qué gano yo con la equidad de género en mi empresa? Y la gente o los empresarios, los propietarios inicialmente lo ven es como un costo. No, es una inversión y es una inversión que genera mayores tasas de rentabilidad y sobre todo mayores tasas de sostenibilidad. Pero para poder apropiar esto hay que hacerlo con rigurosidad y mi sugerencia específica sería avanzar en esas certificaciones. Nosotros, por ejemplo, desde el gobierno colombiano trabajamos con una certificación que es Equipares, donde en este gobierno ha tenido un aumento muy importante esa certificación de empresas y lo más importante para todos los empresarios y las empresarias que nos están siguiendo en este momento es que además de ser un compromiso social, vuelvo y reitero esto que es muy importante, una empresa que tiene mayor equidad de género es una empresa que tiene un mejor entorno laboral, que tiene más productividad, que genera más rentabilidad y es más sostenible. Y termino con esto. Les decía yo que Colombia ha sido seleccionado como el primer país a nivel internacional en estructurar un bono soberano de género. Y hace 2 semanas teníamos un evento con ONU Mujeres y con IFC del Grupo Banco Mundial. y estaban ahí en esa mesa sentados los principales inversionistas, y este dato es muy importante porque muestra lo que está pasando en el mundo y lo que tenemos que apropiar en nuestros países. Decían los inversionistas que en el marco de este COVID, o si podemos ya hablar de post-COVID, todavía no lo sabemos, en esta coyuntura, cada vez más los inversionistas, cerca del 60% de los inversionistas internacionales están apostando dentro de su tesis de inversión a invertir en aquellas empresas que tienen el tema de sostenibilidad, de equidad de género o de impacto en jóvenes, en promedio. Pero mucho más interesante lo que está pasando con la juventud, los millennials. De ese 60% se sube a un 80% el interés de invertir en empresas que le apuestan a la equidad de género. Así que sí o sí, la equidad de género es más rentabilidad, más sostenibilidad, hay que trabajar en equidad de género en el sector empresarial. Gracias.
So I want to add a word, but I must first apologize. My translator machine died, and so if I am simply repeating in English, something that you just heard in Spanish, I'm very sorry, because I couldn't understand what they were saying. But I want to suggest that what we can all do as employers, whether we are legal employers or otherwise, is to be intentional as we bring our workforce back into an in-person meeting, working space. And what I mean by that is things that might look like they are neutral may not be neutral in the impact that they have. And here's an example. In our country, when schools were still out of session and all kids were learning remotely and at home, employers who said, well, it's completely voluntary to our workforce if you wish to come back to the office or not, thought they were saying something that was neutral from a gender perspective, and of course, for many, it was not. Because if the women are disproportionately the caregivers for the children, saying come back if you want to is meaningless to that woman. She can't come back if her kids are at home and she isn't sharing that duty with her domestic partner. She doesn't have a choice. So being intentional to make sure that we are not unintentionally doing things that impact women more harshly, I think is extremely important as we all step, we hope, out of this pandemic over the coming months and into whatever the new normal is. So it requires us to listen, it requires us to ask questions, and it requires us to think about what we are doing in a different way as we go forward.
Thank you, Trish. Are there any questions from the audience of any of our panelists? Yes, please.
Hola, ¿se escucha? Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Valentina Ramos. Esto no es una pregunta, simplemente es un agradecimiento hacia ustedes y hacia todo el público que está aquí, tanto Colombia como absolutamente todo el mundo entero ha vivido de desigualdad, no solamente de los hombres hacia las mujeres, sino de las mujeres hacia los hombres, y en específico de cualquier tipo de población. Todas han sufrido en algún momento de desigualdad. Mujeres, hombres, comunidad LGTBI, cualquiera ha sufrido desigualdad. Qué dicha es ver en especial a mis compañeras de la universidad acompañándome, a mis doctoras, mis profesores, a todo este público maravilloso, y absolutamente estar en este congreso y ver que hay tanto apoyo hacia las mujeres y hacia el empoderamiento que nosotras tenemos. Tenemos que seguir en esto. Lamentablemente, me duele decir que ha sido una lucha llegar hasta aquí de parte de las mujeres, porque ha sido luchado. Esto no es que un presidente se monte y nos diga, no, ahora le voy a dar participación a las mujeres. Tuvimos que vivir una etapa histórica terrible y gracias a la democracia hemos podido estar aquí. Gracias a la participación femenina y a personas como ustedes, yo puedo estar ahora dándole las gracias. gracias al público, gracias a ustedes por esta ponencia tan genial y un placer conocerlas.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for attending today. Oh, we do have one more question in the back.
Muchas gracias. Un saludo a todas las panelistas. En verdad es un orgullo tenerlas en nuestra tierra. Para nuestra consejera Gheidy. Consejera, ¿cuáles son las políticas públicas activadas para apoyar a la mujer rural involucrada en procesos de desarrollo, involucradas en el sostenimiento de la paz, que son realmente a lo largo y ancho del territorio colombiano estratégicas para que nuestro país en verdad pueda tener un cambio prioritario? ¿Cuáles son esas estrategias? Porque realmente la mujer rural, la mujer campesina necesita un apoyo extraordinario de parte del gobierno. Gracias.
¿Cómo es tu nombre y de qué entidad vienes?
Bueno, mi nombre es Erika Rincón, del Ministerio de Justicia.
Erika, muchísimas gracias. Y además agradecerle al Ministerio de Justicia porque ha sido el gran partner, el gran aliado para la realización de este evento, y te agradezco mucho que nos hagas esta pregunta porque en los 7 minutos que teníamos de panel era muy difícil poder explicarlo, pero sí, quiero decirte que dentro de nuestra política de equidad de mujeres, las mujeres rurales han sido centrales, por lo menos con 4 estrategias. Lo primero, ¿cómo ayudamos a ellas a generarles oportunidades económicas? En la medida en que las mujeres rurales son claves para la consolidación de la paz en los territorios colombianos, tenemos que permitirles a ellas la generación de negocios que les permitan salir de economías ilegales a economías legales con rentabilidad. Por eso el eje central de esta política de emprendimiento tiene un especial foco para las mujeres rurales y hemos creado el programa Mujer Rural Emprende. Resultados, Erika, porque esto no es solamente retórica de política, sino son acciones concretas que llegan al territorio. En una alianza que hemos denominado el Pacto de la Mujer Rural, liderada por la Vicepresidenta de la República y en alianza con todo el sector agro, con todo el sector comercio y con el sector trabajo, porque el SENA ha sido fundamental, y también con ustedes, ya hemos apoyado a más de 600.000 mujeres rurales en sus emprendimientos. ¿Para qué? Para que se conviertan en mujeres y empresarias y puedan tener ingresos que les ayuden, y esta palabra es fundamental, dignificar sus vidas, las de ellas y las de sus familias. Primer elemento. Segundo elemento, también sabemos, y esto es en alianza con ustedes, con el Ministerio de Justicia, que son las mujeres rurales la población más impactada por la violencia intrafamiliar, además de sufrir la mayor recarga en las labores de trabajo. ¿Qué hicimos? En alianza con ustedes, y esto es una apuesta de Estado, con la Fiscalía General de la Nación, con las comisarías, se lideró el programa Justicia a la Puerta para Mujeres Rurales. Es un programa que ya lleva más de 2 años de implementación, y lo que hicimos fue identificar los municipios con los mayores indicadores de violencias y llegamos a los hogares de esas mujeres rurales, en las veredas, a hacer 2 cosas, Hilarie. Primero, a generar conciencia en el grupo familiar de que ningún tipo de violencia se vale. Por supuesto, sabemos que son las mujeres las más afectadas, esto con una pedagogía desde las nuevas masculinidades. Y el segundo mensaje es que si esa línea se pasa, hay toda una institucionalidad para acompañarlas, y eso está funcionando, y estamos dejando esta capacidad en cabeza de las secretarías de la mujer regionales, que también la vicepresidenta Marta Lucía Ramírez ha liderado en su fortalecimiento y en su creación. Y la tercera línea a la que quisiera también hacer referencia es que en el marco de la implementación del Plan Marco de Implementación de nuestra política de paz con legalidad, en los municipios PEDET, en los 170 municipios PEDET, han sido las mujeres rurales centrales, tanto en la estructuración de proyectos para ellas, como en la financiación de proyectos. Yo ya vemos cómo esos grandes resultados, esa inversión de más de 10 billones de pesos ha tenido como foco central a la población de mujeres rurales.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking this incredible panel, the 3 on Zoom and the 3 present today with us. Thank you so very much. And thank the audience for being so attentive. We hope you found this helpful.